Another characteristic of fonts that you'll want to control is the size, and when setting the size, you'll first have to pick between absolute or relative units. Absolute sizes are commonly specified in pixels, and pixels give you very precise control over the font size. Relative units, like percentages or the keywords larger and smaller, or ems, they allow you to set a font size based on some baseline. So 2 EMs would be twice the size of the baseline, and 0.8 EMs would be 80% of the baseline. Many people today use EMs for relative font sizing. One reason is relative sizes allow a user to scale up the text using their browser, and this is something they might want to do because the text is hard for them to see. Relative sizes allow that to work. Some of the other properties of a font that you can set are the font style, to force an italic font, or the font weight, to make a font bold, and the font variant property will bring in a typeface that uses only capital letters. Let's use what we've learned so far to improve the look of this page. The first thing I want to do is de-emphasize that H1 element a little bit. It needs to be an H1 element because it is the primary header for this page, but it's a little bit too large for my taste. So let me set the font size to 1.2 EMs. That will bring that down a little bit because typically an H1 tag is going to be well beyond 1.2 EMs. The next issue I want to address is the code listing here. I want this to be a monospace font, and there's a couple different ways to achieve this. For code, there's something specific that I would do, but before I get there, let me show you this approach, which is I have a class on this paragraph element, class equals code, and that would allow me to come into styles.css and say code should have a font family of monospace, and let's make the font size 0.9 ems just to reduce it a little bit. And now it's looking a little more like code, but notice that version info equal, that particular block of text should really be on the next line. And in fact, if we look at the source code here, we can see that version info equal actually is on a different line than the line that ends here with a semicolon, but web browsers generally don't respect things like tabs and new lines and carriage returns inside of HTML code. What they're trying to do is take that text and get as much of it on one line as possible. What I really want to do here is I want to use a pre-tag, which means this is pre-formatted text, and please don't try to manipulate it. I could still use a class of code, but let's just leave it just as a pre-tag to see how that looks. And you can see that it gets indented and it follows the formatting that I have here precisely. In fact, it doesn't even break that second line, even if there isn't enough room to display it, so the user is going to have to scroll or open their browser wide enough to be able to see that entire line of code. And most user style sheets will style a pre-element with a monospace font, so that's been taken care of for us. I also just want to come into the content area and add some padding because it's been kind of bugging me that everything is right up against the border. We know from the last module that padding will push things inward away from the border. And let's also come in and style the ordered list that appears here. What I could say is that for an ordered list, I want a font of, and just specifying font allows you to shortcut setting font family, font size, font style. What I could say is I want this to be an italic, 0.9 em, using a serif font, and you can see how that changed. I don't actually want to override this piece of it, so another way to write this would be to say font style is italic, font size is 0.9 EMs, and now it's still going to inherit the font family setting from the body area. And lastly, there is our copyright notice, which should be in a very small font. So let's come in and put a class of copyright on that particular div. Then I can come into my style rules and say that for a copyright, the font weight should be bold or bolder. Let's just go with bold. And the font size, 0.8 ems. Finally, there are properties you can set to influence the look and layout of textual content regardless of what font you use. These are the text properties. They allow you to indent the leading text of a paragraph, add spacing between letters and words, add underlines or strike-throughs across characters, and perform some alignment and transformations. Let's use some of these properties inside of our application. Inside of our page, let's try out a few of these text properties. I'll start by demonstrating text indent. We'll set it here inside of the content area to a fairly dramatically large value of 3 ems, just so we can see what it's doing. And what it's doing is it's pushing over the text, the first line of text inside of any given element. So the first line of text inside of a paragraph, but also, unfortunately, the first line of text inside of our code and also inside of our list. So let me remove that for right now. So the page will go back to looking a little bit better. And the next thing we'll play with is letter spacing. Now this again is one of those things that you can use for special effects sometimes. So this is going to be on the header element. When I refresh, you can see that all of the letters have been pushed apart. You can also specify word spacing, which is the space between words. And you can see that using and file version info are now much further apart than they were by default. There's also text decoration. So you can do things like underline. That underlines our header. You can also have multiple settings inside of here. So in addition to underline, I could also specify a line through the text, and that gives me that strikeout look. Or we could go with just line through, or we could remove the text decoration altogether. And then there's text align. We've used this before. What I want to do is center that H1 tag so it's in the middle of the page, even as the user adjusts the width of the browser. And you can also use text align to do things like move things to the right or to justify text so that the right edge of the text is always as close to the margin as possible. If I refresh, you can see how it spaced some of those sentences out, but some sentences are just too short to be able to stretch out the whole way by adding an occasional space here and there. And finally, another text property that you'll commonly see inside of style sheets. Some people will set the line height. And what I'll do is set this to 1.2 ems inside of our content. And let's try 2.2 ems. You can see how those lines move apart. And again, that's something that you can use for an effect on the occasional web page. In this module, we've come to understand how to specify fonts using CSS and the difference between a specific font like Arial and the generic categories of web fonts like serif and sans serif. We also talked about font sizing and the pros and cons of relative sizes versus absolute sizes. And finally, we used the font properties and the text properties to style the content of a web page.